of the League of Women Voters of the Ann Arbor area. I welcome you to tonight's debate featuring members of the high school debate team from Dexter High School. The students will be presenting for and against arguments on Proposal 2, which encompasses an independent redistricting commission initiative. Proposal 2, as it states, will be on the voter ballot in the general election on Tuesday, November 6th. The League of Women Voters is very pleased to sponsor these debates. The League is a nonpartisan, civic, and political organization that encourages informed and active participation of all citizens in government. We also work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and work to strengthen and broaden knowledge about our form of government and democracy. The League does not support candidates or parties. We do take stands, however, on issues that we have studied. One of the League's important goals is to assist voters in making informed choices at the polls, and thus we bring you tonight's program. We are broadcasting from the studios of CTN of Ann Arbor under the direction of the network's production professionals. Volunteers from the League of Women Voters are managing tonight's debate. Our moderator this evening is John Chamberlain. John will now introduce the participants and explain the debate format and guidelines. John?
Thank you, Donna. We are pleased to have the debate team from Dexter High School participating in tonight's debate, organized by the League of Women Voters. Tonight, 4 students from Dexter will be debating ballot proposal 18-2, which, if approved by voters, will amend the Michigan Constitution to establish an independent citizens committee to draw new district boundaries for Michigan's congressional, state senate, and state house districts following every census. Dexter High School has been involved in competitive debate at both the state and national levels since 1994. In that time, the team has won the most prestigious awards in the debate world, including several state championships as well as national recognition. It has won the George Ziegel-Miller Award for being the best overall debate team in the state multiple times. And last year, it qualified a public forum team to the National Speech and Debate Tournament. The Dexter coach, English Department Chair Deb Marsh, has been teaching and coaching debate and forensics in the state of Michigan since the 1983-84 school year. She has been named Debate Coach of the Year 4 times. She was inducted into the Michigan Speech Coaches Hall of Fame in 1995. And most recently, her colleagues honored her legacy with a named trophy, the Marsh, to be awarded annually to the best public forum debaters in Michigan. 9 members of the Dexter debate team have participated in the preparations for tonight's debate, although only 4 will be seen on camera. The 4 students you will hear from tonight are, on my right, the team arguing in favor of Proposition 2, Rose Riley and Zane Aridi, and on my left, arguing in opposition to Proposal 2, Ethan Dunn and Hannah Jacobson-Harm. The rules for the debate are as follows. Each side will have 6 minutes to present their opening arguments, beginning with the for side. Each side will then have 4 minutes to respond to the other side's opening arguments, beginning again with the for side. I will then direct questions to the teams, beginning with the against side and alternating who responds first to a question. Each team will have 90 seconds to respond to each question, and we will spend about 8 minutes on Q&A. In closing, each team will have 2 minutes for a closing statement, beginning with the against team. And timekeepers from the League of Women Voters will keep us on schedule by reminding speakers how much time they have left in each segment. So let's begin. The ballot wording for Proposal 2 is as follows. A proposed constitutional amendment to establish a commission of citizens with exclusive authority to adopt district boundaries for the Michigan Senate, Michigan House of Representatives, and U.S. Congress every 10 years. This proposed constitutional amendment would, first, create a commission of 13 registered voters randomly selected by the Secretary of State, 4 each who self-identify as affiliated with the 2 major political parties, and 5 who self-identify as unaffiliated with major political parties. Secondly, it will prohibit partisan office holders and candidates their employees, certain relatives, and lobbyists from serving as commissioners. 3, it will establish new districting criteria, including geographically compact and contiguous districts of equal population, reflecting Michigan's diverse population and communities of interest. Districts shall not provide disproportionate advantage to political parties or candidates. And finally, it will require an appropriation of funds for commission operations and commissioner compensation. With that, we begin the debate with the opening statement of the team that supports passage of Proposal 2.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rose Riley, and my partner is Zaina Reedy. I would like to thank the League of Women Voters and Mr. Chamberlain for the opportunity for my school to participate in this debate. My partner and I are arguing in favor of Proposal 2. As Mr. Chamberlain said in his introduction, this proposal creates a nonpartisan committee to redraw congressional district lines to better represent Michigan voters. Currently, every 10 years, the state legislature is charged with creating congressional districts. The problem is that partisan legislatures use their political power to draw districts that disproportionately benefit candidates from their own party. This means that disadvantaged populations are grouped into districts that do not adequately represent them, taking away the impact of their voting voice. According to the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, Michigan is one of the most gerrymandered states in the U.S. A Gallup study done in 2017 reports that 45% of Michigan voters identify as Democrats, whereas only 38% of Michigan voters identify as Republican. Despite the majority of Michigan voters identifying as Democrats, we have an overwhelming Republican majority in our state legislature and federal representatives. This disparity is explained by the gerrymandering of congressional districts that gives Republican candidates an advantage over Democrats in elections. In the status quo, Democrats in gerrymandered districts have very little say in who their representatives will be. This has detrimental effects on political representation and therefore undermines the principle of democracy by making the process of voting less impactful on the results of the election. In order to remedy this undemocratic and unfair system, Proposal 2's nonpartisan committee will be chosen through a lengthy selection process. The applicants would be selected through a statistical weighing process that will match the demographics of the committee with the state as closely as possible. Therefore, a committee that best represents the population and the interests of the state will be formed. We believe that the citizens of Michigan should vote in favor of the proposal because of its transparency. A September 25th article from the Center for Michigan revealed how business interests and GOP insiders shaped Michigan political boundaries behind closed doors during the 2011 district map drawing. State legislators used supposedly nonpartisan organization called the Michigan Redistricting Resource Group, which under a federal lawsuit has now been exposed as a group of private GOP consultants. Proposal 2 will stop this kind of clandestine behavior as it requires that the new commission hold 10 public hearings across the state to solicit information from the general public. This in itself is a powerful reason to vote to adopt the proposal. Our democracy is based on an educated electorate who participates fully in the process. Under Proposal 2, the electorate is finally reintegrated into the process of creating congressional districts in a public and transparent way, which allows for the electorate to know and understand the process. A second reason the voters in Michigan should adopt the proposal is because when partisan politicians draw the maps, minority party voters cannot be heard. According to Michigan Radio's Zoe Clark, Democrats won over half the votes for State House in 2016, but Republicans won most of the seats. When the Republican legislature drew the map in 2010, they tried to make sure that their voters were in a majority in each district, lumping together the Democratic voters so their votes didn't matter. The idea that a political party would bias the district map seems unimaginable under a democracy. However, we are not the only state in this situation. 12 states have already passed proposals on nonpartisan committees to draw new district maps, and there are 5 ballot proposals in other states this November to change the way that states draw their district lines. In order to allow voters to choose their politicians, instead of politicians choosing their voters, we must adopt Proposal 2. The third reason the voters in Michigan should adopt the proposal is because of the emphasis placed on objective fairness measures for newly drawn districts. According to the Center for Michigan, the proposal establishes new redistricting criteria, including geographically compact and contiguous districts of equal population, reflecting Michigan's diverse population and communities of interest. And the districts created under Proposal 2 shall not provide disproportionate advantage to political parties or candidates. These requirements will act as a mission statement for the committee and will guide their decision on which map to select for the state. There are guidelines concerning compactness, contiguity, and fairness of districts under the status quo. However, these are mere guidelines and not the guiding principle for creating districts as they will be under Proposal 2. In order to make Michigan a state where fair and democratic elections, where voters choose their politicians and not the other way around, it is imperative that Michigan voters vote to adopt Proposal 2 in November. Thank you.
Now the opening statement from those arguing in opposition to Proposal 2.
Good evening, everyone. My partner and I stand in opposition of Proposal 2, which aims to redraw congressional lines through a nonpartisan committee. Under the current system, partisan gerrymandering creates congressional districts that tend to favor a particular partisan group. Proposal 2 aims to prevent gerrymandering by creating a committee that will redraw congressional districts in a nonpartisan way. Though we agree that the present system is not perfect, the process for redistricting outlined in Proposal 2 has a number of flaws within the specifics of the proposal. We disagree with the proposal for 3 reasons. 1, it is expensive, the committee is made of unexperienced individuals, and it won't solve the problems it claims to address. In order to understand why we believe this, we'll begin our argumentation with our first point. Proposal 2 will be expensive. According to the Detroit Free Press, the commission is expected to cost $5.5 million a year. This money will be used to pay commission salaries, the cost of the selection process, and the creation and operation of the committee. The money to support the commission would be appropriated to the Secretary of State's budget. Although $5.5 million sounds like a lot of money, the reality is that it would likely cost much more. Both California and Arizona have nonpartisan commissions very similar to Proposal 2, and both states have ended up spending much more than they had predicted. According to the Citizens Research Foundation of Michigan, in California, the cost of their first try using a citizen commission was about $13.8 million. Around $4 million was used for the state's extensive selection process, and $3 million was used for developing the redistricting plan. The remaining expenditures were for costs that occurred after the plans were adopted, particularly legal expenses. Michigan's proposal will likely face legal battles if it is adopted. This money will come out of the general fund, which affects other programs like road repair and education. Taxpayer money is crucial in sustaining many social programs in Michigan, so the added cost of fighting legal battles and the selection process for nonpartisan commissions is disadvantageous and should be considered by voters before going to the polls. Secondly, the proposal does not require anyone to have experience, training, education skills, or expertise. According to the Ballinger report, selection as a commissioner is based entirely on an applicant's geographic residence and the demographic characteristics they possess, along with a lot of random luck. Supporters say commission selection is akin to jury selection. Proposal 2 does not even require a face-to-face interview. This is in sharp contrast with a thorough interview process that applicants for independent redistricting commissions have in both California and Arizona. Additionally, the Citizens Research Foundation of Michigan explains that the majority of the commission members are unlikely to have any sort of educational background in policy, ethnography, or other fields relevant for working on the redistricting process. The process of redistricting is involved and complex. It requires a depth of understanding in all factors that make a fair district and how to apply all those qualifications to an entire state map. With little experience in policy for redistricting, it is unlikely that the committee will be able to effectively redraw congressional districts without being prone to bias. In Arizona, they hired a consultant to assist their inexperienced committee in the involved process. According to the Detroit Free Press, the Arizona's commission work and maps drawn were affected by partisan politics. The commission hired a Republican-leaning consultant that affected how the committee members drew the congressional districts. Andy Minkoff, a Scottsdale Democrat who sat on the Arizona's first redistricting commission, said, "The change was a step forward because it made the process transparent and gave citizens a chance to be heard. But partisan politics infected the commission's work and affected the maps it drew. In 2001, we were very clearly manipulated by a Republican-leading consultant the commission hired, Minkoff said. Finally, it is completely impossible to eliminate gerrymandering under the status quo because the locations in which Democrats live in the state of Michigan will necessitate gerrymandering if our aim is to adequately represent them in congressional bodies. According to the Detroit News, Democratic voters tend to be clustered in urban areas, while Republicans are spread out more uniformly across the state. Since Democrats are not spread out throughout the state in the same way that Republicans are, it would be difficult to create many contested districts without gerrymandering. Finally, through past precedent, nonpartisan committees have shown to be fairly ineffective at preventing extreme partisan in politics. According to Jason Barraza, a Democratic political consultant in Phoenix, the commission has not reduced extreme partisanship in Arizona politics. The committee was affected by partisanship bias and struggled to work effectively. Past precedent shows that this Michigan committee will probably end up failing to create contested districts and prevent gerrymandering in Michigan. In review, Michigan voters should not vote to adopt Proposal 2 because of the unexpected costs, the lack of experience of the committee members, and the impossibility of ever truly solving for gerrymandering. It is also important to take into account the past precedent of other states that have enacted similar policies to Proposal 2 when voting for or against the current proposal. Spending a large sum of money on a commission to create a system that is prone to flaws and potential gerrymandering is not beneficial to Michigan voters. Therefore, we stand in opposition with Proposal 2.
Thank you. And now the response from the team in favor of the proposal.
While the con side makes some good arguments, they are certainly not without contention. With that being said, let's look at their first argument about this being an unexpected cost. They compare us to states like Arizona and California and how the cost is higher. However, currently the proposal allocates $5.5 million each year to the costs of the committee. This is only 0.1% of Michigan's total budget. Even if this number would be doubled, it would still be a minuscule price to pay for a more fair and just democracy. In fact, I'll reference Winston Churchill's words. A democracy is the worst form of government except for all of the other ones. We cannot create a government that is perfect, and there is no way for us to eliminate bias. However, having a committee which is less partisan than the current way that we redraw congressional district lines is certainly a step in the right direction and going to help ensure voter representation. Now, moving on to their next point about inexperienced committee members and a lack of accountability. I have three responses to this. First of all, just because somebody on the committee hasn't priorly held office doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. If anything, it's a benefit because it reduces the bias of that individual member. If they had held office previously, that means they're probably more likely to having biases and alternative motives. My second response is in accordance with All Things Considered Michigan Radio. They say that there's a lot of resources that will go towards helping the commission form its final redistricting plan. The proposal includes language that will allow members to hire staff and consultants, including legal representation, to assist with data collection and analysis. In addition, the public will have plenty of input. The proposal requires a minimum of 15 public hearings throughout the planning process. The proposal ensures that this committee will have available resources to make the best congressional maps possible. The committee serves as a way to have the least bias. My third response is to address accountability. The committee can still be held accountable if they are to collude with lobbyists or other special interest groups. In such occasion, they can be kicked off of the committee off of reprimandatory action. Now, moving on to their third point, which is that we won't completely solve this problem. They give Arizona as an example of how bias can still affect the process. However, keep in mind, Arizona had 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 1 nonpartisan member on the committee. We have 5 nonpartisan members on the committee, creating the largest represented group. So ultimately, we feel like there will be less bias. They also say that we can't move voters because they live in certain areas. However, due to the Voting Rights Act, we have to establish minority districts which have been used as Democrat packing areas, where we put in a lot of Democratic voters so they have less representation. If we vote yes on this proposal, we can move them out of these districts, giving better representation to Democratic voters. Ultimately, if we reject this proposal, it's highly likely there will be no other solution to this burden to our democracy. We agree with Nancy Wang, an Ann Arbor attorney. It's certainly not going to be a panacea, but it's a big step forward. Compared to what we have right now, it's night and day. It's infinitely better. For these reasons, we strongly urge you all to vote pro on Proposal 2. Thank you.
Okay, your response.
To start my rebuttal, I think it is important to address that both sides of this debate agree that gerrymandering is a problem. Furthermore, it is necessary to consider the fact that eliminating some of the carefully constructed district lines that our opponents are calling gerrymandering in this is highly unlikely to be solved by voting for Proposal 2. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act included the requirement for majority-minority districts to be created in order to prevent the dilution of minorities' voting strength. For example, Congressional District 14 is recognized as one of the most gerrymandered districts in Michigan because of the Democratic packing that has occurred in that minority district. However, the Commission will have to create minority districts under Proposal 2 because the state is still responsible for following federal laws. Another claim the PRO makes is that the committee will be nonpartisan. The assumption that the committee will actually be nonpartisan is highly improbable. No one is completely nonpartisan. Everyone has their own personal biases, past experiences, and exposure to the 2 major political parties, which will inherently influence their ideology. Thus, Proposal 2 is too idealistic. Moving on to the pros' refutations to our case, we start with the cost of Proposal 2. Firstly, the cost being 0.1% of the Michigan General Fund is still a substantial amount of money that will be taken out of other programs. And that is without considering the potential increase in cost due to lawsuits. Remember, this is millions of dollars which should be going to the reconstruction of our roads, funding of social programs, or funding our education system. The pro side brings up the point that the proposal will only cost 0.1% of our state budget. However, if the 0.1% cannot prevent gerrymandering, consequently not fulfilling the purpose of the proposal, then it's a waste of taxpayer dollars, especially when they can't quantify the effectiveness of the proposal. Moving on to the problems with citizen-led districting. Although the committee requires a lack of experience in policy, this can lead to a map that is poorly drawn regardless of bias. The Secretary of State can hire congressional mapping experts for the committee that can be biased or favoring one side. Remember the Arizona example that we read you in case, where the state hired a party-affiliated committee consultant who was able to influence the way the committee decided to redraw the districts. While Proposal 2 may be a different process, remember, partisan bias is unavoidable. These committee members also don't have any experience in congressional line mapping or in policy. We agree that the members of the committee should not have held any previous political position. However, policy education is important in order to draft new congressional lines. On their point about committee accountability, while collusion is reprimandable, we have no insurance if we are dissatisfied with the committee's draft. The only alternative would be lengthy legal battles, which will add to the cost of the proposal, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you, and I urge you to reconsider Proposal 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now I'll pose some questions to the teams, beginning with those of you who oppose Proposition 2, and go to the point that you were just talking about of the ability of the committee to be independent. And the argument here, I think, is that that it is important to create a level playing field for electoral politics, as level as we can get it, so that bias isn't built in to the election and subsequently to the legislature and to the law. And you may disagree with that in principle, but I didn't hear it, but if you do, tell us. And secondly, you suggest that it's more or less inevitable that partisanship will creep in. The question, what is it about the structure of this commission that leads you to think it's more or less going to happen? And two, is there any reason to think that the partisanship will be any near as important as it would be if one party controlled the process in the legislature?
So we provide you, in our case, the example of Arizona, where it was very easy for another commission person to come in and actually explain how to redraw mapping, and they favored it in the Republican side because he was a Republican representative. And so what we're saying is that, yes, although Arizona, there was only one person that was nonpartisan, it's still a probable thing that could happen under the Michigan proposal that needs to be addressed, and that voters need to take into account when they're voting for or against this proposal. And I think when you see that this example of Arizona and how they addressed this issue and how it actually led to no impact overall for whether or not it was stopping gerrymandering in their state, I think that it is something that Michigan voters do need to take into account, as well as you address that nonpartisan, how are we going to know it's going to be infiltrated? And as my partner read in her rebuttal, she stated that no matter what, people are going to have a bias, whether it's leaning one side or the other. And even if they declare themselves nonpartisan, it's hard to say that in the committee filled with 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans that there's not going to be some influence there in terms of mapping.
Okay. What do you say in response?
In response to that, we'd argue that the Michigan committee is very different from the Arizona committee. For example, the Arizona committee has 2 members of both major political parties and then one member who is not affiliated with either political party. However, in the Michigan committee, there are 4 members from each major political party and 5 members who are not affiliated. This means that the largest group in the committee are actually people who are not affiliated with any political party. And this means that we have a greater assurance that partisanship will not be taking over the committee. This means that we have a bigger buffer between those 2 partisan groups who will help to guide the group towards a more fair and less partisan way of districting the map. Zane, would you like to add anything?
Just to comment on how you said it's better than having one party that's completely in control of the process, because with this committee, no matter what the leaning of the nonpartisan members are, at least there's equal representation of people who solely identify as Democrat and Republican. So no matter what, I definitely think that this will ensure a redrawing of the maps that's more representative of a majority of Michigan voters' interests.
Thank you.
Okay, now a question for you folks. This is a fairly complicated proposal. Its selection mechanism takes a number of paragraphs to explain. It does guarantee a lot of transparency. I don't hear anybody complaining about that. And then there's the rule for how the commission chooses a plan, which is quite complicated. So talk a little bit about the complexity and why that doesn't stand as an argument against doing this.
Sure. Well, we would argue on the affirmative side here that the complexity of the actual proposal is something that safeguards it from partisan influence and from the influence of other things that would take away from the fairness of those congressional districts. The way that we go about selecting a map is a 3-step process. First, in the most favorable situation, the committee would have a majority vote on a map that they all agree upon. If that doesn't happen, we go to something called a rank order voting, where each member of the proposal submits one particular plan. Those plans then get ranked, and then we go down the list of that ranking. So let's say we start on the top ranked map. If that map can get 2 votes from the party that the person who presented it is not from, so let's say the person is a Democrat, if they can get a vote from an independent and a vote from a Republican, or if they can get 2 votes from a Republican or 2 votes from an independent, then that is the map that we select. Then once we've gone through all of those maps, if we still haven't been able to choose one, it goes to a random selection of one of those 13 maps. And we argue that this complex and involved system is actually something that is going to help us select the best map through looking at all of the ideas and all of the input from the committee.
So starting on Rose's evaluation of the 3-step process, right? So we have the majority vote, which we argue, and which I argued in my rebuttal, is the idea that we could have these 5 nonpartisan members actually take sides. And so instead of having 5 legitimate nonpartisan members, we could have an unequal balance there. So the probability of that is pretty high, considering that we know that it's really hard to have an actual non-biased voter. Then we move to the second step, which is rank order voting, which we argue is a really bad thing. So the idea of rank order voting is that they rate the different drafts, is what we're going to call them, in order of success and what they would like for the districts. And then if we get to the random selection, then we end up with a gridlock, which is what's happening currently in our federal government, right? We're having issues in our own Senate and in the House of Representatives. It's really important to understand that if those 5 nonpartisan members take sides, it could happen where we have a gridlock, and then the Secretary of State would end up making the decision, which would then therefore not be a nonpartisan decision. So those are things that we have to consider and that the voters should take into account when voting for this proposal.
And keep in mind that the Secretary of State is a random selection that is not selected by the committee members.
Right. So one of the proposals could get chosen that could be the least ranked on the list.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, you've talked a good bit about the Arizona case, and they're one of the states that uses commissions. What evidence do you have, you can repeat the evidence on Arizona, but from California or other states that use commissions, about their ability to counter gerrymandering and establish a level playing field for politics? And have any of them been successfully, the outcomes of those commissions been successfully challenged in court? Is there evidence that any of them, would be even more biased than a legislature might have produced had it control of the process, which is what we're concerned with here in Michigan?
So what we argue on the con side is that in Arizona specifically, we state that according to Andy Minkoff, a Scottsdale Democrat who sat on Arizona's first redistricting commission, that overall they were impacted by gerrymandering through a nonpartisan consultant, or through an actual partisan Republican leaning consultant, and this actually had no effect on overall preventing gerrymandering in the state. And we're saying if this is a potential in Michigan and we're going to be wasting millions of dollars that could be going to other plans, then overall it shouldn't be worth it to agree to proposal 2. And that's where we provide the Arizona and California evidence from the Detroit Free Press as well, talking about how a lot of the money, around $7 million, went specifically just to legal fees for the commission. And I think we need to take into account the extra money that's going to be added on. We're not unsure of how much, but there's going to probably be more than 5.5 million, which is the expected amount for Michigan. And I think that needs to be taken into account, specifically when Arizona itself had absolutely no effect on the overall gerrymandering in the state.
Let me add one thing. Is there any evidence about how citizens feel about commissions? Do they, wish they hadn't done it? It's not worth the trouble. Is it affecting how citizens feel about their state governments?
We didn't find anything specific on how it affected how the citizens felt. But again, a person that sat on the committee chair and saw that it had no effect because of this gerrymandering situation, it didn't really have an effect. Hannah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's also important to consider the lawsuits. So just the fact that there were a bunch of lawsuits against the redistricting draft, that in itself provides evidence that if we were to adopt the same sort of policy in Michigan, we would have a bunch of lawsuits filed against this commission, and it would be, that in itself is kind of the evidence to show that the people were displeased with the decision.
So, first of all, remember, it's impossible to create a perfect system. There's no solution that's going to completely eliminate gerrymandering. However, looking at Arizona, gerrymandering was still reduced. It's unfair to say that there wasn't any effect at all. And the citizens even found the whole process was more transparent. So ultimately, gerrymandering, while it'll still be a problem, can still be greatly reduced. And the main problem that we saw with Arizona also is the gerrymandering that they had doesn't quite work in the same way as Michigan's, because the majority of voters in Arizona are Republican, whereas the majority in Michigan are Democratic. So currently in Michigan, Democratic voters aren't being as represented, and in Arizona, after the shifts, while Republicans took a lot of positions in Congress, there were Democratic lawsuits. However, that's to be expected as there were more Republican citizens in Arizona. Whereas in Michigan, we wouldn't see the same lawsuits from the Democrats, considering the fact that if we were to change lines, it would be highly likely, since there's a greater Democratic population, we would see more Democratic representation.
Okay, let's move now to closing arguments. And this time, those in opposition get to go first.
Alrighty. Throughout this debate, we have established that gerrymandering is an issue faced by our state. We recognize that it is a problem needing solving. However, we urge voters to consider the fact that Proposal 2 doesn't actually solve for carefully drawn congressional district lines and instead gives a false sense of hope. We negate on the grounds that Proposal 2 will cost far more than the projected amount evidenced by the precedent set by Arizona and California. Due to Michigan's unique demographic, we must use examples from similar states in order to make an informed decision. It is likely that the cost of the proposal will exceed $5.5 million due to the cost of operating the system and the continuous bombardment of lawsuits. Instead of wasting millions of dollars on an empty promise, we should use the money elsewhere, such as the reconstruction of our roads, bolstering our social programs, and funding our education system. Even if the proposal is enacted, the chance that any improvements will be made is highly improbable. It is crucial to understand that a nonpartisan decision is unlikely due to the probability that 5 nonpartisan members of the committee will be influenced by the 2 major parties. This could lead to gridlock, or another draft of gerrymandered congressional lines that favor one party over the other. This means that we will have wasted millions of dollars on a proposal that provided no solution to our problem. The basis of our arguments tonight rest upon the reality that even with Proposal 2, carefully drawn congressional district lines will continue due to the federal mandate in 1965. That requires minority districts to be carefully drawn. This leads to Democratic compacted districts. For example, minority districts like District 14 will remain the same even though Michigan recognizes this district as the most gerrymandered district in a state. Do not settle for this proposal and its inadequate provisions. Recognize that it gives no solvency to gerrymandering and instead distracts our state from an effective solution. Thank you, and I urge you to reconsider Proposal 2.
Thank you. And you get the last word.
All right. So every voter in Michigan should take into consideration several points as they make their decision on Proposal 2 this November. First, voters must confront whether the additional cost of the nonpartisan committee is worth the work on redistricting that it will accomplish. We argue that the cost of formulation and operation of the committee is far outweighed by the effects that such a committee will have on our democracy, as it removes a thorough amount of bias from the process. They try to respond by saying the committee consists of members who lack experience, but remember, they'll have resources available such as consultants and data to help them make the best maps possible. Second, Creating the commission which represents the voters of the state politically and demographically will give us a better chance at having fairer district maps. We may not be able to ensure that gerrymandering will be eradicated, but as long as we can provide a decent step in the right direction that helps address the problems we have right now, we think voters should say yes to this proposal. Third, there will always be a certain level of gerrymandering, as I just said, due to federal mandate on minority districts and in districts such as District 14. However, remember, we can reduce the severity of this problem by reducing Democratic packing in these districts with a less biased committee. Finally, consider what happens if we don't do anything at all. Republican gerrymandering will continue to prevent Democratic voters from having political representation. This is not only unfair to the majority of voters in Michigan that are Democrats, but continuing to allow gerrymandering undermines the concept of democracy. At the end of the day, we need to consider the reality of the situation. If we don't pass the proposal, it's highly unlikely anything will be done to solve the problems to voter representation in the status quo. However, if we vote yes on Proposal 2 come this November, we'll be strengthening our state's democracy and helping restore faith in Michigan voters. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to thank our 4 debaters for their presentations on this proposal to amend the Michigan Constitution. I would also like to introduce Deb Marsh, their coach, who has, put in probably about as many hours as they have getting this organized.
It's been a lot.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Well, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about these kids. First of all, I'm really proud of them for stepping up and doing such a great job tonight. This Zane is a 4-year debater. He's a senior, and he'll be graduating this year. He's a full IB diploma student, and I expect pretty amazing things out of this young man. Rose is a junior, and she is basically our hope for next year too. Like, we've not only have you seen how great she is right now, but she's going to lead our team in the future, and I know that she is also a full IB diploma student, so she will be on her way to, I don't know, changing the world. You can already tell, can't you? Ethan is probably the most, I don't know, he is going to be the best dad or the best teacher or something. He takes all of our little debaters and he turns them into really good speakers and really responsible humans. And I can't say enough about him. He's a senior and he's graduating this year, and he is going to make everybody proud because he's got his own fan club of all our seventh graders on up. They just adore him. And this is Hannah, and she is a senior this year. She's also, these 3 are all 4-year debaters, so they've been around for a long time. And Hannah is a full IB diploma student, and she is, she's going to go out there and she's going to make a difference. I know it because she already, well, you saw that, her intensity and her passion come through, and I'm really just so very proud of them. And thank you guys so much for inviting us. It was a really stressful and challenging because this is a hard topic to get our heads around, and we know that the voters are going to have a tough time, but we hope that we gave you a balanced approach so that you could really make your own decisions on this, and that that we gave you the information that you needed to go out and vote, and next November 6th and be there, go to the ballots.
Thank you all. Donna?
Yes. Thank you all again to the Dexter High School debaters, the students who are present, your researchers who did a lot of work behind the scenes, and obviously your teacher coach who is very proud of you. And we appreciate the participation that you've been in. We also wish to recognize and thank the moderator, John Chamberlain. He's done a wonderful job. Finally, thanks to our volunteers and to league partner CTN for making this live broadcast possible. These debates will be rebroadcast on Channel 19 a number of times between now and the November 6th election. They are also available on CTN's YouTube channel and through CTN Video on Demand for streaming on your computer or your smartphones. You can also go to our website, the league website of lwvannarbor.org, and look for the link to the student debates. Please urge your friends and fellow residents to watch these debates, as well as the many candidate forums that the League has organized for the November 6th election. For additional nonpartisan and dispassionate information on current proposals and candidates for office, please go to vote411.org, the League's voter resource guide covering proposals and local, state, and federal candidates that will appear on the November ballot. And I echo your sentiments. Please make a plan to get to vote on November 6th. Thank you and good evening.